I kissed a man at a black tie gala in front of 400 people, and he was not my boyfriend. The worst part. My boyfriend was standing 20 feet away. I want to say I didn't know what I was doing. I want to say the lighting was bad, the champagne was stronger than I realized, that anyone would have made the same mistake. But the truth is more complicated than that, and I've spent the last 8 months trying to figure out exactly what the truth is. My name is Vivian, and this is the story of the most humiliating, confusing, and ultimately life-changing night of my life. Let me back up. I met Felix Harmon at a rooftop bar in the West Village on a Tuesday in October, 2 years before any of this happened. He was wearing a navy blazer over a white t-shirt, which should have looked too casual but somehow didn't, and he was arguing with the bartender about the correct ratio of vermouth in a martini. Loudly, confidently, like a man who had never once in his life questioned whether his opinion was welcome. I found it annoying. Then I found it funny. Then I was laughing at something he said, and he turned to look at me with this smile. Slow, a little surprised, like he hadn't expected anyone to actually get the joke, and I thought, oh no, that's really how it started. Oh no. Felix was a structural engineer. He designed bridges, which I told him was the most on-the-nose metaphor I had ever encountered in a real person's life, and he laughed and said he'd never thought about it that way. He was warm and solid and steady. He called when he said he'd call. He remembered things. My sister's name, the fact that I hate cilantro, the birthday of my boss that I'd mentioned exactly once. He was the kind of man that every woman in her late 20s is told she should want, and I did want him. I genuinely did. We were together for 14 months before the gala. I worked in development at a nonprofit focused on arts education in public schools. The kind of job that sounds impressive at dinner parties, but pays considerably less than impressive. Every November we threw a fundraiser. Black tie, open bar, silent auction, the whole production. It was the biggest night of our calendar year, and also the most exhausting. And by the time the event rolled around that year, I had been running on 4 hours of sleep and cold brew for approximately 9 days straight. Felix came as my +1. He looked good in his tux. He always looked good, and he squeezed my hand before we went in and said, "You've got this." That was a Felix thing. Simple, direct, exactly the right words. I loved that about him. What I didn't know, walking into that ballroom, was that his older brother was going to be there. I didn't know his older brother existed, actually. In 14 months, Felix had mentioned his family in the vague, deflecting way that some people do. My parents are in Connecticut, my brother's in finance. But I had never met any of them, never seen photos, never gotten more than a surface summary. I had chalked it up to his private nature and told myself we'd get there eventually. His name was Stellan. Stellan Harmon. I found this out later. At the time, I didn't know his name, his face, his height, or his history. I just knew that by 9:30 that night, I was desperately scanning a ballroom, full of people, in near-identical black tuxedos, trying to find my boyfriend to tell him I had 15 minutes before the live auction started, and I needed him to smile and look supportive in the 3rd row. The room was dim. We always kept the lights low during cocktail hour because it made the space look more intimate and hid the fact that the carpet was 12 years old. Candles on every table, the kind of golden, romantic lighting that looks beautiful in photos and makes it genuinely difficult to see across a room. I spotted Felix. Or what I was absolutely certain was Felix, standing near the bar on the far side of the room. Same tux, same dark hair, same height, same build, same way of standing with his weight, slightly shifted to one hip. He had his back to me. He was talking to a white-haired man I didn't recognize. I crossed the room. I was in heels that were doing things to my feet that I do not have the vocabulary to describe. I was holding a clipboard and a glass of sparkling water, and I was thinking about the auction, about the seating chart, about whether the caterers had gotten the allergy order right for table 7. I was not thinking about the possibility that this was not Felix. I came up behind him and I slipped my hand into his. He had his hand loosely at his side and I just took it, the way you do with someone you've held hands with 1,000 times, and I leaned up and kissed him on the cheek. He turned, and it was not Felix. The face was almost right, identical bone structure, same jaw, same dark eyes. But the eyes were different in a way I cannot entirely explain. Sharper, maybe, or more still. And there was a scar along the left side of his jaw, just below his ear, maybe an inch long, that Felix did not have. I know Felix's face. I had studied it for over a year, and in the half-second it took for this man to turn toward me, I knew immediately. "I'm so sorry," I said. My voice came out completely steady, which I will never understand. "I thought you were someone else." He looked at me for a moment that lasted approximately one geological era. Then the corner of his mouth moved, just barely. Not a smile, exactly. Something more controlled than that. "Clearly," he said. His voice was different from Felix's too. Lower, less warm. I took a step back. This is so embarrassing. I'm so sorry," I thought. "You thought I was Felix. It wasn't a question." "Yes, I'm Stellan," I gathered. I wanted to die. I genuinely wanted the venue's 12-year-old carpet to open up and swallow me whole. "I'm Vivian. I work here." "Felix is I know who you are," he said. "Felix mentioned you." Something about the way he said it made me want to ask what Felix had said, but I didn't. I was already holding too much. The clipboard, the water glass, the weight of having just kissed a stranger at my own fundraiser, and I couldn't add anything else. "Right," I said. "Well, it was lovely to meet you, Stellan." I walked away. My heels clicked on the hardwood at the edge of the carpet, and I thought, very clearly, I am never going to be able to explain this. I found Felix 2 minutes later, standing near the coat check talking to my executive director. He looked exactly thus as his brother. I mean exactly. If you had shown me a photo, I could not have told you which one was which. Same height, same build, same coloring. The only difference was the scar, and you couldn't see that at a glance. "Hey," he said when he saw me. "You okay? You look a little." "I just met your brother," I said. His expression did something complicated. "Oh, you didn't mention you had a brother. I mentioned he was in finance. You didn't mention he was your identical twin." Felix looked at me for a second. "I didn't think it was." He paused. "It didn't come up, Felix." I kept my voice low because my executive director was approximately 4 feet away, and I am nothing if not professional under pressure. I walked up to him thinking he was you. I kissed him on the cheek. The color that moved through his face was not quite guilt, and not quite amusement, and not quite something else. It landed somewhere in the middle of all three. "He didn't say anything," Felix said. "I mean, he wouldn't." Stellan doesn't really. Why wouldn't you tell me? Vivian." He said my name quietly, with a slight exhale behind it, the way he did when he thought I was spiraling. "It's fine. You didn't know. He knows that. It's not a big deal. But the way he said it, it's not a big deal. Something about it landed wrong for me. Not because he was dismissing me. Because it felt like he was dismissing something. Some question underneath my question, that I hadn't even consciously thought to ask yet. I went back to work. The auction started at 10. We raised $340,000, which was a record for our organization. I stood at the podium and smiled and said all the right things, and I did not think about Stellan Harmon's eyes or the way the corner of his mouth had moved or the fact that my boyfriend had never once thought to mention he had an identical twin brother. Not until the next morning. The question I kept coming back to was why. Not why did I walk up to the wrong man. That I understood. Bad lighting, identical faces, a room full of distractions. That was a mistake, clean and simple. The question was, why hadn't Felix told me? We had been together for 14 months. I knew his coffee order, oat milk latte, 1 sugar, which he always slightly embarrassed about. I knew he'd had his heart broken badly in his mid-20s by a woman he'd mentioned her name once, and I'd tried not to file it. Someone from his grad school program. I knew he was afraid of heights despite designing infrastructure that other people stood on. I knew his laugh sounded different when something genuinely surprised him versus when he was just being polite. I knew his face better than I knew most things. But I had spent 14 months not knowing that he had a twin brother, that there was a person on this earth who wore the same face and moved through the same world and had, apparently, heard Felix's name enough to know mine. I tried to ask him about it, in the weeks after the gala. I brought it up 3 times, in 3 different ways, and each time Felix did that thing where he answered the question I'd asked without answering the question I meant. They're not close. They had a falling out a few years ago. It's complicated. I noticed, in those weeks, that I had started to think about Stellan Harmon more than I should have. Not in the way I thought about Felix, not warm, not comfortable, but in the way you think about a problem you haven't solved yet. His eyes. The stillness of him. The way he'd looked at me with something that wasn't surprise, like he'd been waiting to see what I would do and had formed a conclusion. I told myself it was just the residual mortification. I told myself I was fixating because I hadn't gotten a clean resolution. I was good at telling myself things. We ran into him again 6 weeks later. Felix had agreed to go to his cousin's birthday dinner. A family obligation he'd been vague about, in the way he was vague about all family things. And I went with him, thinking it would be a chance to finally understand the part of his life he kept at arm's length. The restaurant was in Midtown, one of those places with leather banquettes and a wine list that requires a sommelier. I wore the black dress I wear when I want to feel competent. Felix held my hand in the cab over. Stellan was already there when we arrived. He was sitting at the far end of the table, talking to a woman I didn't recognize, early 40s, sharp-looking, who I later found out was their cousin's colleague. He was in a dark suit, no tie, his collar open by one button. He looked up when Felix and I came in. His eyes went to Felix first and then to me, and his expression didn't change at all. The seat that was left for us was directly across from him. The dinner was one of the more uncomfortable 2 hours of my life, and I have attended many uncomfortable dinners in the name of nonprofit fundraising. Felix and Stellan were polite to each other, the way that people are polite when the alternative would require a conversation neither of them wants to have. They spoke maybe 6 times total, and each of those times was about something neutral: the food, the birthday honoree, whether the cab situation in Midtown had gotten better or worse. I watched them and I could not understand how 2 people who were physically identical could feel so fundamentally different in a room. Stellan spoke less than Felix. He listened more. When someone said something interesting, he looked at them the way I imagined. He looked at a balance sheet, precise, without giving away whether the numbers were good or bad. He was not warm. He was not unfriendly. He was just very, very contained. At some point during dessert, the conversation fragmented into smaller pockets, and Felix got pulled into a discussion with his cousin's husband about something sports-related, and I found myself, across the table from Stellan, in the kind of silence that is either awkward or significant depending on who you are. He spoke first. "How's the organization?" he said. "The gala went well." "Record year," I said. 340. "That's impressive. It was a lot of work, I imagine." He turned his water glass slowly. "Felix mentioned you're thinking about moving into the director role. That stopped me. He mentioned that last month before the gala." He looked at me steadily. He seemed proud. I didn't know what to do with that. Felix was proud. He'd told me that directly, multiple times, and I knew he meant it. But there was something strange about hearing it from Stellan, who Felix had told me they weren't close, who Felix had apparently been talking to before the gala. "Do you and Felix talk often?" I asked. A pause. "No. We had a specific conversation last month. It's not a regular thing, right?" I looked down at my dessert. "He doesn't really talk about you." "I know. No hurt in it, just a fact." "I didn't know you existed," I said, and I hadn't meant to say it quite that directly, but there it was. Stellan looked at me for a long moment. "I know that too," he said. "It's not about you. What does that mean?" He didn't answer. Felix reappeared at my elbow, hand on my shoulder, and the conversation ended. In the cab home, I asked Felix what the falling out had been about. He was quiet for 3 blocks. Then, "It's a long story. We have time, Vivian." That exhale again. "Some things between siblings are just, they stay between siblings, okay? It doesn't affect us." I let it go. I was very good at letting things go. 3 months later, Felix and I broke up. It wasn't about Stellan. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't because I was drawn to his brother, or because I had some secret fantasy, or because I spent those months pining. I didn't. Felix and I broke up because of us, because of a slow erosion of honesty that I hadn't noticed until it had taken too much. I realized, somewhere in those months, that Felix protected himself by omission. He didn't lie to me, not directly, not that I could name. But there were whole rooms in his life that he never invited me into, and when I tried the door, he'd say it's complicated and smile and change the subject. The twin thing was just the first one I'd noticed. Once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. We were sitting in my apartment on a Sunday in March, and I said, "I don't think you actually let me in. I think you let me in to a certain point, and then there's a door and you never open it." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I know." I don't know how to change that. I loved him enough to respect that honesty. I loved him too much to stay anyway. We were kind to each other, at the end. That was the thing about Felix. Even when things were hard, he was kind. We hugged in my doorway and he said, "I think you're going to do great things." Viv and I cried in the elevator on the way down. I did not plan to see Stellan again. I didn't reach out. I had no reason to reach out. I had met him twice, spoken to him for a combined total of maybe 12 minutes, and anything I might have told myself I felt was probably just the displaced emotion of a relationship ending. I know how that works. You look for somewhere to put the feeling and your brain finds the nearest container. It was 4 months after Felix and I ended when I ran into Stellan at a bookstore on the Upper West Side. Not a planned thing, not a cosmic intervention, just a Tuesday afternoon in the wrong aisle, and the fact that we both apparently read the same obscure category of creative nonfiction. He saw me first. I know because when I looked up from the shelf, he was already looking at me, and he didn't look surprised. "Vivian," he said. "Stellan." I held the book I'd been considering like a small shield. "This is a coincidence, is it?" Then, before I could decide whether that was meaningful, "How are you?" "Fine, good, we broke up. I don't know why I led with that. Felix and I, a few months ago." "I know," he said. "Right, of course." I put the book back on the shelf. "How's he doing?" "I don't know. We don't really." He stopped. We spoke briefly. He seemed okay. I nodded. "That's good." We stood there for a moment in the particular silence of a bookstore, which is different from other silences because it has weight and texture. The smell of paper. Someone laughing softly in another aisle. "Do you want to get coffee?" he said. Not like he'd been building up to it, just like it was the obvious next thing. "Yes," I said. And that was that. Here is what I learned about Stellan Harmon over 3 hours in a coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue. He was 2 years older than Felix. He had gone to Wharton, had spent 8 years in private equity, and had left 2 years ago to start his own firm, smaller and more selective, which he ran out of an office in the Flatiron district. He had a dog named after a constitutional amendment. I'll let you figure out which one. Who he described as an anxious golden retriever who has expensive taste in treats. He read nonfiction almost exclusively, with an occasional exception for crime fiction, which he said he was slightly embarrassed about. He had lived in London for 3 years in his early 30s, and still sometimes thought in Celsius. He was 38. He had never been married. He talked the way he looked at things, measured, precise, no word wasted. But underneath that, there was something I hadn't expected from our 2 previous encounters. Actual humor. Dry, understated, the kind where you almost miss it if you're not paying attention. Once, I almost missed it. Then I laughed about 10 seconds too late, and he looked at me like he was filing that away somewhere. I told him about the organization, about the director role I had, in fact, moved into 6 weeks ago, a title I was still getting used to. About my apartment in Crown Heights that I loved and the radiator that I did not. About my family, my mother in Philadelphia, my younger sister who was finishing her PhD in comparative literature at Berkeley, and called me every Sunday to read me passages she found beautiful. He listened, completely. No phone, no glancing around, just listening with that stillness that I had found unnerving the first time and now found something else. When we finally looked up, it was past 6. I had been in the coffee shop for 3 hours and it had felt like 45 minutes. "I should go," I said. "You should," he agreed and didn't move. I picked up my bag. "I'm glad I ran into you." He looked at me with that expression I was starting to be able to read, the one that meant he was being careful with what he said next. "I'm glad you kissed the wrong brother at your gala," he said. I burst out laughing. I hadn't expected it. He watched me laugh with something in his face that he almost let me see. "I have to ask," I said when I could. "What did you think in that moment, when I did that?" He considered it. "I thought you must love him," he said. "The way you walked across that room, you weren't looking at anything else. It was such a precise, honest observation that I didn't have anything to say to it." "I did," I said finally. "I did love him. I know." He held the door open. The cold air hit us both. "He loved you too, for what it's worth. What happened between you two?" I said. I don't know what gave me the courage to ask it out loud, there on the sidewalk in the November dark. He was quiet for a moment. "Our father left our company to me," he said. "Felix expected it to go to him. He's younger, but he was more involved in the day-to-day. I think he felt it was his." A pause. He wasn't wrong that he'd earned it. I think our father made the wrong call. But you took it anyway. I did. I've asked myself whether I would do that differently. He looked at the street. I don't have a satisfying answer. That honesty hit me somewhere specific. Not because it was what I wanted to hear. It was the opposite of what I wanted to hear. It was complicated and unsatisfying and real. But I had spent 14 months with a man who gave me smooth, palatable non-answers. And this was something else entirely. Thank you for telling me, I said. You asked, he said, like that was the whole equation. We had dinner the following Saturday. I will not tell you I went into it without thinking about what it meant. I did think about it. I thought about Felix, who I still cared about, who I had not spoken to since March, and who I did not know if he knew his brother and I had run into each other. I thought about the fact that I was 31 years old, and I had just gotten out of the most serious relationship of my life, and this was probably the worst possible time to walk toward another Harmon brother. I thought about all of that. And then I got on the subway and went to the restaurant. Dinner was 3 hours. We talked about his firm, my organization, a book we'd both read about infrastructure and American cities that we had somehow independently found in the same month. He ordered food the way I'd expected, purposefully, without a lot of deliberation, and he ate without being weird about it and refilled my wine when it got low without making it a whole thing. At some point, he said, I want to be honest with you about something. Okay, I said. I don't know how to do this if it's going to be a problem. He said it looking directly at me. Felix and I, we don't have a good relationship. I'm not sure we ever will. And if being near me brings up things you're still working through about him, I'd rather know that now than cause you pain later that I could have avoided. I looked at him for a second. You're asking me if I'm over your brother before we've even... I'm asking if this is something you actually want, or something you're doing because you're sad about something else. He was very calm about it. Those are different things and they lead to different places. It was the most confrontational conversation opener I had ever encountered on a date, and it was also one of the most decent things anyone had ever said to me. I'm not sad, I said. I miss him sometimes, that's allowed, but I'm not here because of him. He held my gaze for a moment, then he nodded once and picked up his menu again. All right, he said. You're very direct, I told him. I've learned that the alternative is worse, he said. I want to tell you I knew exactly what I was doing from that point forward. I want to tell you I had processed everything cleanly, that I had no residual confusion, that walking toward Stellan felt uncomplicated. It wasn't. It felt like driving a road I'd been on before, except all the landmarks were in different places, and the weather was different, and I wasn't sure the destination was the same. Familiar in structure, completely new in everything else. He called me Sparrow. I asked why, once, and he said it was because I moved very quickly and landed unexpectedly in places he hadn't anticipated. I told him that was either the sweetest thing anyone had ever said to me or a very polished insult, and he said he'd let me decide. I decided sweet. He looked pleased in the way he looked pleased, which was quietly and without much fanfare. We were careful. I don't know how else to describe those first months. Careful with each other. Careful with the question of Felix. Careful in the way of people who have both been hurt before and are not interested in being reckless. He told me things, real things, hard things, and I told him things back, and it was not smooth or effortless the way that falling in love looks in movies. It was deliberate. It was chosen, over and over again, in small moments that accumulated into something I didn't have a name for, until one Sunday morning in his apartment on the Upper West Side, sun coming through the windows at a low winter angle, his dog's head on my knee, and Stellan across the room making coffee. And I thought, this is the life inside the door that was always closed. I spoke to Felix once, briefly, about 6 months into whatever Stellan and I were. Felix called me. I answered because I still cared about him, and because I had promised myself, when we ended, that I wouldn't make the ending ugly. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, the careful, affectionate conversation of two people who are not what they were, but are not nothing either. At the end, he said, "Is it weird if I say I'm glad it's you?" I didn't know what to say to that. He's better with you, Felix said. I've seen it, somehow. His voice was complicated in the way his face used to be, the way I'd learned to read in a year. I'm working on being okay with all of it. I'm glad, I said. I hope you find someone, Felix. I mean that. Yeah, he said. I know you do. And then, take care of yourself, Viv. You too. I don't have a clean lesson to offer you from all of this. I've heard the takes, that I chose danger over safety, red flags over a good man, that I should have been more loyal, or more careful, or more aware. I've sat with those takes. Some days they land harder than others. Here is what I actually think. I think I was in love with Felix, and that love was real, and it mattered. I think his way of keeping me at a certain distance wasn't cruelty. It was fear, and fear is not a crime. I think the end of that relationship was genuinely sad, and I don't wish it away. And I think that sometimes the most important thing in your life arrives because you walked across a dim ballroom and grabbed the wrong hand. Stellan still calls me Sparrow. I still pretend to find it slightly embarrassing. His dog, Amendment, Fourth Amendment, if you must know, because he protects the space and resists unreasonable searches, sleeps at the foot of the bed and snores quietly, and I have stopped finding it disruptive and started finding it like home. Some things you plan, some things you walk across a dark room toward, thinking they're one thing and find out they're entirely another. I'm still figuring out what that means, but I'm figuring it out with Stellan, which is the part I didn't plan and cannot imagine changing.